I'm Sienna. I'm the kid.
I'm Sarah. I'm the mom.
This is Queer Kid Straight Mom.
Let's talk. Welcome back to Queer Kid Straight Mom. A couple of episodes ago, we talked about how much money Republicans were spending on anti-trans advertising for their campaigns and how we thought that was kind of ridiculous because it doesn't really seem like people care about that message. We're not sure now.
How naive and foolish we were.
Perhaps. So we are going to revisit that topic and, talk about some of the commentary that people have had since and dive a little into whether we think that is actually something that made a difference in the election. Joining us today is Sienna's dad, my husband, Brian, whose qualifications are really that he's just a big political science nerd and has been reading a lot about this topic. And we've been talking about it so much as a family. We thought it would be interesting to get some of his perspective, especially because he tends to listen to more, not right-leaning, but like more sort of recovering Republican forums.
A lot of formerly conservative, not MAGA types.
He did also run for office that one time.
I ran for office 4 years ago in 2020.
And get this, he is the first straight man who has appeared on this podcast. We have invited a couple of other men who haven't been able to make it, so congratulations.
Yay, me.
All right. So in the immediate aftermath of the election, I saw, just a couple of comments like, Democrats should not have doubled down on all this trans talk, which was kind of odd because you're also hearing from the far left. Like, I really wish the Democrats hadn't ignored trans people. So, Sienna, do you feel like you saw that same messaging? Did you hear more of the people on the left saying that the Democrats lost them because they didn't reach out to them enough? Or did you get the sense that not, disavowing trans people hurt the Democrats?
Well, I've also seen both messages. What I think hurt Democrats, I don't think that the trans people who were maybe less inclined to vote for Democrats than they should have been, I don't think what was making them not support Democrats was necessarily specifically Democrats not being super supportive explicitly about trans rights. I think it was like maybe that was a piece of it. It was really a whole snowball of things. I think what bothered me the most was actually, I didn't necessarily expect a lot of, really forward messaging about, yes, trans pride, woohoo, love trans people. But what bothered me was the couple of politicians like John Tester and
Colin Allred in Texas.
Colin Allred, that's right. And then there have been a couple of others who have come out since the election saying, oh, this is what cost us the election. And that's what bothers me more than anything. I don't expect like a big celebration, but I do expect, a basic respect of this is an important cause for us to stand by. And that is what Democrats have been really failing on from my perspective. But obviously, also, a lot of people have seen that basic level of compassion and respect for human dignity as a wholehearted embrace of trans people and wanting to turn all of the children trans. So I don't know.
Right. And, really the only example, and we'll kind of go into this in more detail in a minute, that you had was, Kamala Harris talking about how she followed the law, regarding prisoners and gender-affirming care. I think you could feel like she didn't say enough, but I certainly don't see that as thrusting the trans issue in everybody's face.
Well, and it also wasn't part of her platform either. It was like people brought that up from 2020, but it was not anything she was running on in 2024. Like, I don't think she would have brought up trans people at all.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not like it was a campaign promise.
Well, and I think there's an interesting, call it a vibe, right? That interview from 2019 or 2018 when she made the comments, she was asked directly about it, right? It wasn't, again, even at that point when she was trying to occupy a much more progressive lane, that wasn't really her agenda. It wasn't her campaign. And I think that actually carries through when you listen to people talk about the trans issue. Again, it's more vibes than anything. This was not a central campaign to the best of my knowledge, any Democrat that I saw running up and down the ballot. It was just sort of like the campaign message was like, well, trans people are people too, and they deserve human rights and to be treated with dignity. Like, I don't really know why this is much of an issue. And I think what sort of is coming out is that there's definitely a feeling out there. And I think it's because the commercials we saw run, politicians on the right looking for a wedge issue to exploit. And I think, like, again, and back to vibes, maybe a lot of conservative adjacent podcasters, the Joe Rogans of the world, kind of elevating it as, oh, look, here's what those crazy people are doing. And I think we'll probably talk about this more, that it's not just trans issues, but it's lumped in with a whole lot of other crazy cultural issues that Democrats are doing. And you can kind of fill in the blank with X, Y, and Z, lump them all together and sort of create a toxic stew of an issue that seems to have had at least some impact on a really tight election.
The transgender sex changes on immigrants argument is a good example of that, right? Because it's not just about trans surgeries, it's about immigrants, and it's about the things that the government's spending money on, and it's lumping all of those things together.
Right. And a podcaster I listened to, Sienna listened to it and got very, very angry at the comments he was making.
Oh, we're going to talk about.
Okay, we'll talk about Sam Harris. But the comment that he made about, we're going through this epidemic of high school girls or junior high girls seeking double mastectomies. And like, I'm sure it happened out there, right? But this idea that this is latched on ties in with a discomfort that a lot of people have with schools having not performed, right? And you can think about kids in big city schools in Chicago and Washington, D.C. that stayed home too long during the pandemic, or the entire school shut down for places that those of us in Montana, right, didn't experience. And then you've got bad test scores. And then you've got, schools where kids are graduating that don't know how to read. And you can lump it all together as in, we've got these failing schools and Jimmy went to school and came back Jamie. But I think, like, the more I think about it, the more I hear and listen. I don't think it's just about the trans. I think it's the trans issues layered on top of failing schools, trans issues layered on top of immigration.
The woke mind virus.
The woke mind virus, right. It's a virus. It's not just that we're trying to treat trans people with dignity.
Right. Republicans are absolute masters of the scapegoat, right? And so they take real issues that people are concerned about, like inflation or immigration or, failing school systems or infrastructure, and then are like, but don't blame us for not being effective at government. Blame XYZ group.
Exactly. Since Dad brought it up, do you want to introduce us to that podcast? He heard it and then sent it to Sienna and I to listen to. And we both were like, what? Who is this guy?
And I don't know what his background is. Maybe you can tell me. But political commentator, exists in podcast world, a very anti-Trump, former Republican, right? He had no qualms whatsoever in voting for Kamala Harris in this election. But as we listen to him interview and sort of analyze Democratic failures in the postmortem, brought up a whole series of trans issues, right? And specifically cited this epidemic of, I don't remember if it was junior high or high school girls having double mastectomies, of public schools essentially encouraging kids to transition. And the comment that he made that made me like really perk up my antennas and like, whoa, what the heck is going on is that the American people are just not ready for a trans MMA star to beat the crap out of a biological woman. And I said to myself, wait, this is very obviously referencing Imani Khalif, right, who is suing people that have called her trans. What really jumped out to me was here's a sympathetic person to Democratic cause, somebody that's a proud Harris voter that went and debated Ben Shapiro on Ben Shapiro's show about why conservatives should be supporting Harris. And he still entertains these very, very clearly, completely unrealistic ideas and even dangerous ideas about trans women. And I thought that was really interesting and really telling in the aftermath of your guys' previous conversation about the trans ads during the election.
One of the first things he said as he was getting into it that really irked me was that, and this is The Bulwark, is the podcast that we're talking about, if you want to look up this episode, or we'll put a link to it on the website too.
If I can interject, for what it's worth, I disagree with a lot of the writers on The Bulwark about, a lot of things, but I do respect the work that they do. And it is interesting. So, it's not like this is like some crazy right-wing podcast that dad's listening to either.
Right.
Yeah, it's, interesting analysis, and they have interesting perspectives.
I think they're thoughtful and well-meaning.
So Tim Miller, who was conducting this interview, I actually thought did a really good job of pushing back on some of the things that Sam Harris was saying. So, yeah, I mean, it's not like a crazy out there right-wing situation at all. He was saying that he feels like all these elite institutions like colleges and hospitals, I don't remember the other one he said, but are giving into pressure on the trans issue. And that really bothered me because like he even said like Mayo Clinic, and I don't know, the implication that the doctors at Mayo Clinic are saying what they're saying about transgender care because somebody pressured them into saying it as just a blanket statement seemed like a really, really questionable thing to accuse them of.
Right. Well, what was fascinating to me was that, he spent a significant portion of the rest of the podcast talking about, you have all of these right wingers who are never exposed to any serious information. Like they just sit around watching Fox News, and we need to respect the institutions that provide actual information. And I'm like, wait, you were just accusing all of those institutions of being brainwashed and pressured by the far left. Like, what are we doing here?
The reason this is relevant is because he was really implying that this race was lost largely because so many sort of centrist Democratic voters in this election were so turned off by this, like, he didn't say woke mind virus, but like...
But he did everything except say woke mind virus.
Yeah. Just really, to me, illustrated how little understanding there is of these issues. It's not this like culture war. We want to turn everybody trans. And I think he even said something about, yeah, I remember this was the other thing that really upset me. He said, people tell you you're a horrible parent if you don't just decide to like take your kid in for medical care immediately if they say they might be transgender. You listen to your kids, respect their opinions, have them talk to a doctor and a therapist if this seems to be a really big issue. But nobody's saying if you don't haul them in for surgery, you're a terrible parent.
Okay, so I'll push back a little bit on that. Somebody somewhere probably said something like that, and then it got played on Ben Shapiro show, and then Joe Rogan picked it up, right? And then, so a lot of people who are, and this is something I've been thinking about, a lot of people that are only marginally attached to politics and not voting necessarily on policy issues, but are voting more on vibes, and that, that a Democratic candidate trying to run on a platform of equality is having a hard time reaching out to those particular people, are getting messages. They're getting, we'll call it information, call it news, right? But they're getting some things that are pretty clearly skewed relative to what's happening in the real world. Like I said, like some trans MMA star out there beating up on women, that there's this epidemic of schools, right? The schools that can't get kids their free lunches, right? Schools that don't have supplies, teachers that are buying supplies out of their own pockets are somehow providing surgery for trans kids in the, 6 hours between 9 o'clock in the morning and 3 in the afternoon when the parents pick them up, right? It's just so bizarre to even think about. And yet there it is. Like, that is very clearly what a lot of people are taking out of the information ecosystems that they're consuming.
I knew a guy who worked in the Salt Lake County Democrats office with me who started talking about, he heard from someone who knew someone who had a hook surgically installed in her daughter so that she could wear a tail because she was a furry. And me and the guy who was like in charge of the office were both like, no, what are you talking about? That would never happen. That's not even, someone somewhere one time said that trans kids should immediately get surgery level. That's like, that would straight up never happen. Conspiracy, government is sterilizing people with planes level nonsense.
Well, we did find out at trivia last night. We got this right.
Go team.
It was what percentage of smaller content creators, not like big, massive followings, don't fact check the information that they put out there. And it was 60%.
And I think that was self-reported, right? I think it was a self-reported survey, like of nano creators reported that they don't ever check their content.
Which is wild to me because as someone, I have like my little book review platform or whatever. And, I reshare stuff on Instagram. I only reshare stuff that's either like from a source that I know has actual information or like stuff that's opinion, right? That is, here is an event that everyone knows happened. Here's my opinion on it. And that I'll reshare like if it's a good take. But if I'm sharing like, oh, here's the statistic of XYZ, it's going to be from like an actual newspaper or someone I know researches and sources their facts.
Right. I mean, it seems like such a basic thing to follow. Like, that's why we put every source we use on our website so you can check it out. And like, if I see something somewhere that, even if it's a publication I respect, but that I know leans strongly one way, like, I'm going to look and see if I can find it from other places first before I start sharing it, because I want to make sure that it's not just one person heard something and they're reporting how they interpret it. Apparently, this is not what most people are doing, which explains a lot of what's going on.
Which I guess ties back to our failing school systems and the fact that people are not learning basic information literacy, apparently.
Right. It's interesting. Trump won, and pretty quickly afterwards, Nancy Mace, Congresswoman from South Carolina, said that the Capitol needs to not allow transgender women in women's bathrooms, and made a big fuss and like said some really offensive things, like jumped on that immediately, which to me implies that, she felt, oh, this issue has a lot of momentum right now. Because really, if Nancy Mace starts talking about something, it's because she thinks it's going to get her a ton of attention. I don't know. Does that mean that it was that decisive of an issue in the election, or is that just, her perspective? I mean, do we read anything into that?
My immediate instinct is that, she's not looking for attention, or rather she is looking for attention from normal people, but she's looking for attention of, wow, I can't believe she's doing that. Isn't she crazy? That kind of attention. And then the, wow, standing up for us, so amazing attention, that's coming from her base. So my immediate thought is, no, that's not representative of cultural momentum, but that's also exactly what we were saying before the election. And then that isn't really what the election results or the polling on the specific anti-trans ads bore out. So I don't know.
So thinking back on to, and talking to other people and running for office, one of the biggest things that you need to do is to raise a whole bunch of money. And, in my 90-day campaign, I needed to come up with something like $20,000. And it felt like a whole lot of asking to do that. And a congressional race, I think you need at least 500. And I'm kind of making this up, right? You can't put this in the show notes because I haven't verified it. But I think you need $500,000 for a relatively low key race, and an expensive race. You might spend $5 or $10 million pretty easily. And so I think there's an element of, we know there are a lot of people that are very emotionally attached to this who will respond to a fundraising pitch, right? That Nancy Mace is now, and it's a cultural issue, right? She is fighting, right? She is standing up for your evangelical white Christian values, right? And so I think there's some incentives in there just for that. I think there's incentives in there to get on the news, right? There's certainly a way in which politics has evolved into a looking for more likes, for social media presence. It used to be that when you retired from Congress, you would go into lobbying, right? That was how you actually got your payout, was by getting hired on to come back to Congress and lobby. I think now they're increasingly looking at influencer sort of money returns post-Congress. So, I think there's a lot of incentives that point somebody like Nancy Mace, who recall 4 years ago voted to impeach Donald Trump, one of the few Republicans, to sort of pursue some things that look really, it's sort of bizarre behavior to me. Like I don't really know why that would bother anybody. Certainly not enough to pitch a big fit about it, and certainly not enough to change the rules of in the Capitol building that have worked absolutely fine for, I was going to say 200 years, but I guess women weren't in the Capitol building that entire time. I don't know, 100 years of women being elected to Congress. So I don't, it's certainly reflective of something that's not serious legislatively, but there's a lot of reasons why somebody might be pushed into doing it.
What's the saying about no such thing as bad publicity?
No
like
such
that
thing
just
as bad
seems to be
publicity.
sort of
Yep.
the way politicians operate at this point.
Right. And when you think about even in a competitive congressional race, that you're going to have 40% of people that are going to vote straight line Democratic, and you're going to have 40% of people that are going to vote straight line Republican, or maybe it's 45, and you got 10 people in the middle who are probably really low information, probably aren't going to pay attention to this in particular, right? They're not tuning into the minutia of congressional details, right? It's not going to offend anybody that would be just like, oh, just let trans people be, right? Because they're not going to tune into it. So it pushes the activist base, it helps generate money, and it doesn't alienate anybody that wasn't going to vote against her anyway. There's only upside, there's no downside, even in a competitive district.
If I can guide the conversation in a slightly different direction, something I've been thinking about is a kind of different facet of the argument in some Democratic circles has been, well, it's not that we can't, support trans people or support inclusive policies, but the language activists are forcing us to change the way we talk, and it's taking away our common sense language, and that's what's alienating people, which was another one of the things that came up on that podcast. But it's also something that I hear from all over the place, like the idea that, oh, we're being forced to put pronouns in our bios when we're obviously a woman or whatever, which I think is really frustrating. I don't know.
Sam Harris did mention that like, and then somebody who's obviously a man has to put he, him, and whatever. And that seemed to really, really bother him a lot. I don't know. Is that among that crowd? Is that something that comes up a lot?
So as I've been thinking through this as sort of a Democratic politician and somebody who has run for office and what I would do and how I would do it differently, I think there's an element of truth there, but I think it's bigger because I've made some comments to Sienna specifically about that. And then I've kind of like reconsidered a little bit. I think there's again, talking about people who are sort of in that low information vibe space. I think that the people who do lean towards using more inclusive language, people that are looking for more inclusive policies, tend to communicate those in ways that just come across as really strange and not normal. And not to reference other people's podcasts all the time, right? But like Joe Rogan does a really good job as a podcaster, is really famous and effective as a podcaster because like everybody, well, not every, the half of the population that's male that listens to him, I don't think he has a lot of female listeners, but he just seems really relatable to all the bros, right? And people that stumble over over pronouns or over really strange phrasings of things like unhoused people or birthing people or however, like it just seems weird, right? And so even if we're advocating a policy of, hey, transgender people should be included with all the same rights and privileges as the rest of people in society, when things get bogged down into weirdness over language, like I think that creates a vibe that people that might be receptive to the message of inclusivity feel a little bit like they got pop quizzed in class. Like I showed up just looking to vote and like you made me do a pronouns quiz. So I think there's an element of that. I wouldn't like overdo it because I think there are other issues in that space that are more significant, but I think it's part of the broader feeling.
I wonder if that has to do with, just that sort of general, we hear a lot about like Trump voters in particular saying like Stop calling us stupid. Do you think there's an element of that when you tell us we said something wrong? It's not even about how we feel about it's being said. We're just tired of people acting like we're too stupid to know the right way to say it.
Yes. It feels very much, like I said, I think it comes off to, in particular, and I know like this is the election that's all now about working class men, and like because working class men have it so tough, and well, the guys that I'm paying $75 an hour to whatever, like they've got it bad. I know it's really tough being male, middle class, and white, but it does trigger some things inside them that they're insecurities and and just annoyances, right? We know, again, like looking at it as a Democratic politician, we know that Democratic policies are really popular, right? In Florida, right, that the reproductive rights amendment to the Constitution got 57% of the vote, and so did Ron DeSantis, who wants to ban abortion after the moment of conception, right? So it's not policies, it's something in there in that vibe that's changing 20% of the vote and making people vote against the policies that they actually prefer. And I think language, I wouldn't oversell it, but I think it's an element in there that we at least need to think about, and how that affects people and how that affects messaging.
Well, it seems like a good point. Yeah, that elitism that people talk about, like Democrats have been really ineffective in not coming across, one of the things I've seen a lot of people talking about in terms of the economy has been, it felt like Democrats were just saying, well, the economy is great, actually, so why are you complaining? You're just stupid. And even if the economy is good, and there are obviously factors that are causing some kind of warped perception of the economy, the way that it was getting messaged was clearly very ineffective. You brought up the birthing people example, though, and I'm glad because that was one that I was actually specifically thinking about in the last week or so. Because if you are a politician or, a journalist, maybe someone speaking to the public, how do you navigate, right? We want to use language that isn't going to make people feel stupid and isn't going to make them feel like, what is happening? Like, why I don't understand where this is coming from. But I was thinking about it because I'm like, well, that's one that my emotional reaction is, yeah, that sounds weird. Like, why do we have to say that? But also, I imagine that if I were pregnant, if I were being a parent, if I were going through the birthing process, and I was constantly seeing stuff, oh, pregnant women need access to healthcare, pregnant women need this and that, women giving birth, XYZ, nursing mothers, et cetera, that would take a really big toll on me, actually. And the only reason that I have that emotional reaction of this isn't that big a deal is because that's not something I have experienced or intend to ever experience. And so, I mean, I think when we don't process the impact that being constantly exposed to that kind of language has on the people who it affects, it's easy to be like, why don't we just use the same language that people are accustomed to? But it does have an effect. And so how do you navigate that as someone who's using the language, who's speaking in front of people, who's writing for a large audience?
I mean, I think that's the puzzle that leaders in a more inclusive world need to unravel. Yeah, like the really flip responses, don't ask me, I lost my election. Like, I obviously, I haven't figured it out. But I think it's challenging, right? I think as people that do believe in inclusivity, I think it's really hard to square that particular circle. How do we talk inclusively without sounding totally artificial and unnatural? Presidential level politicians that have done really well in my lifetime, right? Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, and to a lesser extent, call it an overperformance relative to what he should have done, and put Donald Trump in there, that whatever it is, like, they have communicated really well to their people, and they've overperformed what you would have expected in a normal world because of it. And people that didn't communicate very well, people that didn't have that sort of connection, the first George Bush, Hillary Clinton, to a lesser extent, I'd say Kamala Harris in that vein, like, people just don't, they're just not natural. They just don't seem, it just doesn't seem normal. So I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you square that circle, but I think it's an important task to take on. And I think actually like one thing that the activist community probably needs to really think about is why does a person like Sam Harris or Mona Charen or some of these other commenters that are at least open to center left ideas and to a more inclusive world feel really uncomfortable with the way they've been called out, the way that maybe they've been attacked by not using proper language. Again, this is not about the problems of middle class white people necessarily, right? But you mentioned about how you can see that hearing that language all the time, nursing mothers and all that, like would wear on you. And like maybe it's a similar sort of thing that's going on with people that are just sort of trying to navigate their world. You know what I mean? That was a lot of circular talking, and I didn't actually have an answer.
There are rooms full of Democratic strategists having these exact same conversations, and they haven't figured out an answer. So I kind of doubt that we're going to figure out an answer. But I think it's a conversation worth having, right?
Well, and I think the fact that I keep hearing all these conversations about working class people, and I guess I'm a weird example. I'm a tradesman. I work in construction. I also have an advanced degree, right? So like by my day job, I'm the working class white guy that they keep talking about on the news. But by education, I'm the sort of coastal elites that all the working class people apparently hate. At least maybe I have some connection to what some of the people out there in the real world are doing that maybe Democratic strategists in a lot of more insular communities don't have.
It is funny though, because I see the working class Americans and blue collar workers, etc., saying, we're not being heard. The Democratic establishment is so elitist, and I see a lot of the people in my more leftist circles saying the exact same stuff, right? Saying, Democrats have no idea what the actual problems are. They're, spending a zillion dollars on Beyonce coming to play, and it's the same complaints. So it is interesting that there's just such a disconnect between those two groups.
I mean, it would probably be really helpful for everybody across the political spectrum to like find some sense of community and like we all feel the same way. We're just directing it at different things. And like, I don't know, that is a common experience. We've just chosen different, places to direct that based on like the policies we like or, thinking human rights are important. I don't know. A couple of counterpoints to it being the transgender thing. Last week here in Montana, a representative introduced a motion to ban transgender women from the bathrooms in the Montana State Capitol. We have a trans representative, Zoe Zephyr, who's
friend of the pod,
who's been on a couple of times. She's great. We love her. Presumably this was directed at her and it didn't pass. And some Republicans voted against it and said things like, well, how are we going to enforce that? Like test people's chromosomes? Or this seems like an unnecessary distraction from the work we need to do. So I did take note of that, like in a state like Montana, if there were all this like anti-trans momentum coming off of this election, I feel like people would have jumped on board with that. But there was still a level of like sort of the sentiment we talked about in that episode a few weeks ago of like, is this necessary?
I guess what we'll have to see going into the legislative session then is how much those same legislators then turn around and support legislation attacking trans people, right? Like we've passed anti-trans legislation in Montana multiple times. How much of it is a genuine, like, I'm not that offended by trans people, and how much of it is, I don't like this attack on this one specific person who I've interacted with and I know is pretty chill. But even then, that's optimistic, right? Because even if, maybe they're not supporting the trans community writ large yet, the fact that she's there working, like making connections with people, showing that she's a normal human being who would like to just use the bathroom in peace like everybody else. That's still a good thing, right?
It's good. And I think my point just being, I feel like if there were this wave of momentum behind this issue, everybody would be like wanting to jump on board with it because they think it's going to help them with their constituencies, right?
Right. No, I agree.
It could be they could do horrible things moving forward. I just feel like I don't think there is a moment that people are swept up in if I look at that coming right after the election.
And I think if you look
Sure.
like the podcasts I've been listening to, people that do focus groups suggested that maybe the trans ads might have had a net effect of a little over 2 percentage points in the focus groups that they were looking at. If it's that way universally, right, that could maybe potentially flip a really close state. Or maybe it was a little bit bigger in some of these states that have shifted, New York City and Los Angeles and places that shifted in a more dramatic fashion to Republicans than swing states, which shifted like actually very, very little. But I think you take small victories on that. If those issues are shifting 2% in the broader electorate, you could easily see how there are a lot of old Republicans in a Montana legislature just being like, this kind of stupid. And going back to the weirdness vibes, right? They might like feel that it's really weird to have a freak out over Zoe's been using that bathroom for what, 4 years? Why are we going to freak out about this now? Whereas if we're still catching vibes, if we're still hearing stories on the 60% of podcasts that are not fact checked about, the epidemic of mastectomies among preteen girls, or right, like they might actually, like you could see somebody holding both. It's not a problem at the legislative level, right? But it's still something that it is our job to be concerned about what's happening to kids in our schools, and thinking about it more from a misinformation, disinformation aspect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I think that's the tragedy, like why trans people probably make such an easy scapegoat as well. Like, it's 1% of the population. And so there's a substantial portion of people who either have never met a trans person or don't know that they've met a trans person. And so yeah, it's really easy to say, "Ooh, the scary transgender's coming for you in the bathroom," when like maybe you've already shared a bathroom with a trans person and you had no idea.
We can probably guarantee that you have.
Right. And so, but the fact that it's such a small portion of the population means that most people aren't aware, like haven't, don't have a Zoe Zephyr in their lives, someone that they know is trans and they're working with and are like, oh, she's just going to the bathroom like a normal human being and then coming and working on, legislation to protect the agricultural sector. And yeah, it's easy to demonize trans people. Like a lot of people don't have that model in their life. But I think if more people did have that, I strive to believe that most people are not motivated by just wanting to be jerks all the time, and most people are just kind of misinformed.
There's an interesting parallel, and we've kind of talked about this on the politics of it. But when I think back to growing up in the 80s, the explosion of the AIDS epidemic, and then the whole series of political questions that came out of that, right? Gay people in the 80s were really weird, right? Like they were like dressed up funny in leather and had the act up parades in New York City and San Francisco, right? That loud and out loud and proud. I remember the sayings exactly.
When you say they were weird, you're saying that's how people.
That was a very mainstream reaction.
I just want to clarify that you're not actually saying that those people were weird.
No, it felt like it at the time, right? And because to your point, most people didn't know a gay person growing up. And then like through the 90s, right, and thinking about the baby steps by which the gay rights movement achieved some of its big goals. I remember being really disappointed in having conversations in high school about the don't ask, don't tell. Clinton bill was like really kind of disappointing, but was a pretty big improvement over ruining people's careers over being gay. And then, and it was 15 years later that Barack Obama ran in 2008, opposed to gay marriage. And California passed whatever the anti-gay marriage proposition was. That was only 16 years ago, right? Like, I think now, previous podcasts that we were referencing, most kids probably have a gay teacher, right? A gay teacher can bring their partner to, or husband, wife now, right, to a social event and not worry about being an outcast, even in some pretty rural evangelical type places. And so there's been like this
shift
for now. Well, but I think relative to like, I think of that in parallel to some of the trans issues that we're talking about that you just mentioned, right? That at less than 1% of the population, most people have never experienced an out trans person, or they've almost certainly shared a bathroom with a trans person at Costco or at the mall or whatever. They just don't know it. But that is part of the process of going from something feeling weird, something feeling super, super countercultural, something being like scary, right? And if we think about like some of the gender affirming treatments that kids might experience, if we think about that in parallel with the AIDS epidemic and how that felt culturally, like you can see how, I don't want to say it's natural because I think that lets people off the hook, but you can see how it's a very common response for people to sort of have a really bad freak out reaction before they get to a more normal spot. Like, yes, Zoe should be able to use the bathroom. You know what I mean? Like those are the steps by which marginalized communities gain equal rights to full protection under the law.
Because I suppose it would be too much to ask for people to be like, oh, I had that freak out about gay people and then it turned out gay people were fine. Maybe I can just skip the freak out with trans people. That would be too much to ask.
There are a lot of voters that turned 18 after 2008, right? And we use like, I'd use 2008 as sort of a big switch because I think everybody knew that Obama wasn't actually opposed to gay marriage, even if he said so on the campaign trail. And then 4 years later or 5 years later, the Supreme Court declares gay marriage legal in all 50 states and like whatever, it's all gone now. So anybody under the age of 35 doesn't even remember a world in which gay people, they would say it in a way in which gay people didn't have equal rights. You know what I mean? So like there's a huge part of people that can't even make that parallel because they weren't alive.
I mean, in fairness, they are not the majority of people who are voting either.
So really quickly, just my other thing that I just recently saw that I thought, okay, maybe this is a counter narrative, was an article about the gains that Trump made with Hispanic men and kind of pointing out that even though this has been a pretty good economy for a lot of people, and Hispanic men have also made gains, they're doing better, but they're not doing as well as white men. They haven't made as big of gains as white men. So when we looked at those economic issues and said, okay, that's BS. The economy's fine. What really made you vote that way? There is maybe an argument that for a group that really shifted over to Donald Trump in a big way, it was the economy for them, because even if they're feeling the effects of a good economy, they are watching the people around them do better and still feeling like, I don't get what they get. I don't get to be up there. And
well, and crucially, I think a lot of this goes for, I think, a lot of non-white men broadly, that there's this feeling of, I am meant to be a provider. I'm meant to be working for my family. I'm meant to provide what my family needs. And I can't do that. And we sort of tend to make this assumption that like, oh yes, all people of color know that racial oppression is a thing and they're like big on the like, equality, no more racism, etc. I think that actually feels disempowering for a lot of especially the men in that position, right? They don't want to say that, oh, the reason that I can't do this is because of racism. I think that if you've been told your entire life that you have to be able to do this, this is your responsibility, that feels like you're like letting yourself off the hook. You're making excuses, and yet you're also working as hard as you possibly can, and you're not doing as well as the people around you. And that for a lot of people in that position whose instinct isn't immediately to blame systemic racism, that I think it's emotionally easier to say it's the economy. There's something wrong with the economy because I'm working just as hard as Bob next door, and yet Bob next door can afford a giant pickup truck and a boat and I can't.
We make a lot of comments about like, I don't know, there are a lot of people buying really expensive stuff for this bad an economy, but maybe that is evidence that there's still a feeling of working hard and not getting anywhere.
I think that's actually really true. And Sienna mentioned it a little bit earlier, right? When Democrats would message on the economy, oh, the economy is not that bad, right? And I totally am one of those people, right? Every single day I'm, hey, record number of airline passengers over Thanksgiving. Thanks, Joe Biden, for ruining the economy. So I'm the worst offender But that being said, if we try to extend some grace and some sympathy to people, so in my industry, that male Latino worker was probably making $25 an hour in 2018. He's probably making $50 an hour right now. And I think psychologically, we tend to, hey, I got a raise, and that's reflective on me as a person, as a provider, right? I worked hard, I got a raise. And in that $25 an hour raise, I had to spend a bunch of it on taxes, right? Because I make more and they take more, right? That's a very working class, like you hear that all the time on a construction site. And groceries are substantially more expensive than they were, right? And maybe I'm paying a little bit more in gas. One of the ones that I've heard recently, I went out and bought a new truck, right? Because I got the raise and my insurance went way through the roof, right? Insurance has been a terrible one. And the trucks that they started, like all the trucks are like falling apart, panel gaps, right? The quality of the things that we're buying. So I got this big raise, right? Due to my own masculine, rah-rah, working all the things. But a lot of that money didn't immediately feel like half of that raise went to treading water financially. And the other half I ended up having to spend on things that didn't really feel like I got that much benefit out of it, like my new truck. So like, I think if we think about the way that people's relationship to their work, people's relationship to finances work, like even if somebody did objectively end up substantially better off than they did, they might be really, really frustrated by not having made the gains that they thought they earned. And again, communicating and the vibes, right? When we're listening to the bro podcasts, right? We're hearing about how bad things are, right? We're hearing politicians tell us how bad the economy is and feeling some of that, right? You guys have heard all my stories about supply chains that we've been dealing with in the last few years. And like, it doesn't feel good to go to work under those circumstances. And so I think if you have a traditionally masculine, even one that's a positive masculinity of being a provider and working hard and all those things, like you could feel like you really got the shaft, even though objectively you're doing substantially better now than you are before. And that's really easy to shift 4, 5, 6 points in a national election under that vibe.
Yeah, well, and for what it's worth, right? If all wages go up by, 100%, but you have groups like Latino men, like Black men who might be underpaid relative to their white counterparts, then their wages, like the wage differential actually ends up worse off. And like a lot of what we do is not an objective, like, where am I relative to where I was 10 years ago? It's a where am I relative to the people around me? Mm. And so if Democrats then message based on, but look, wages have all gone up 100%, that doesn't resonate with someone who's like, okay, but why does my neighbor have a boat and a truck and I don't?
Right. Still not gaining on the American dream, which then you really wish you could get into conversations about like, well, but which party actually wants to help take away those discrepancies? But we're not going to talk about that now because that is a whole different conversation and too frustrating.
And it's the same stuff we've already talked about, though, right? It's that Republicans are great at scapegoating, and it's that Democrats are not good at messaging and politicking.
All right, I'm going to throw something else in there at the Democrat, and this is one of my pet peeves. I'm talking to people about housing, right? And housing's been a huge driver of inflation over the last 4 years. Huge portion of why people have such negative feelings about everything. And that I've told you guys, I've pulled out my old receipts and you guys, your generation in Bozeman, in an expensive place, you have to work the same number of hours at your canvassing job or at KJ's construction labor job to pay the rent that I did 30 years ago. But man, like I said, if we tie that back into, well, I'm working really hard and I got raises, like it doesn't, even though it's objectively provable that a huge part of that comes from liberal and left-leaning people that I have conversations with, right? So it's out there. Matter of fact, I had a Facebook post to another former state representative 2 or 3 years ago complaining about he was running for office at the time then too, about inflation. I sent him a message offline. I said, like, maybe if you're a Democrat running for public office in 2022, think it was 2022, like you probably shouldn't be reminding people about inflation as a liberal, like just saying. He's like, oh yeah, thinking about articulating that point for my opponent.
Well, that's the challenge, right? Is that there are, again, it's like I said earlier, right? Is you have working class Americans who might lean culturally neutral, but, are frustrated with the economy. And then you also have a bunch of leftists who are also mad about the economy.
Right.
And so, and the problem is that Republicans have this absolutely unified, like, we're going to do whatever the party says, whatever Donald Trump says, that's what we go with. And then you have actual like debate and contention happening in the Democratic Party, which is like healthy for democracy, but also means that the group is splintered.
And also that a bunch of people that feel like they're on the losing end of that policy discussion or vibe discussion might end up staying home.
Exactly.
In conclusion, I think that it might not be the trans thing that threw the election.
I think the trans thing is ancillary to a lot bigger issues. Like it's there and it's relevant, but it's not. Democrats aren't going to win elections just because they throw trans people under the bus based on that.
Right. I mean, I think some of the Democrats who have been saying, "Oh, this is our problem. This is the whole issue, and we need to just stop supporting trans people, and that will help us win elections," are not recognizing that the response to trans people is symptomatic of a whole host of problems that this country and the Democratic Party have politically that need to get worked through. And yeah, the solution is not to say, we're going to stop supporting trans people. We're going to stop saying trans women are women. The solution is to deal with those underlying problems.
And I want to throw out one other thing in the context of the trans ads moving the election. Kamala Harris only lost by about 250,000 votes across 7 swing states. She only lost the vote by 1.5%. Democrats picked up seats in the House. They didn't lose. They only lost 1 competitive seat in the Senate in what could have been a really disastrous Senate map. So to act like, I think for a lot of us on Team Blue, the navel gazing and the recriminations over some of the stuff are maybe a little bit misguided. Like it's not as though we need to make wholesale changes to our trans rights platform, gay rights platform, any of those things that are issues. It's some relatively minor changes that need to deal with that probably being a relatively minor issue that's symptomatic of a broader problem.
Yeah, I mean, Democrats lost the presidential race with a presidential candidate who only had 100 days to run a campaign, with like an absolute mess of a campaign from the guy before her. Yeah, it's the fact that she was actually really competitive and close.
Right. We'll point that out
that
the guy that she stepped in for had a lower approval rating when he dropped out of the race than Donald Trump did when Donald Trump left the White House after having cited an insurrection. Like that was there's some big headwinds there.
Yeah, I think people looked at the results in the couple of days after the elections and were like, "Oh my God, it's the end of the world." And obviously, a Donald Trump presidency is very bad, and we are not happy about that. But I don't think that the Democratic losses were as catastrophic as they might have initially seemed either.
So we're sticking to our original point.
We're sticking to the point. It's partly there, but it's not all.
Yeah.
The thing is not all the thing.
Yes.
Okay, so next time we are going to be talking about a movie that I'm sure everyone has seen, like, ads for at this point because it's been everywhere to the point that I think some people are annoyed already, but that's okay. We'll just annoy you some more. We're going to be talking about Wicked Part 1, which is in theaters right now and has been largely really well received. But, I went to see it the other night and I was blown away by not just how, sort of superficially queer friendly it was and just sort of wonderful to see from a queer perspective, but also the messaging that was really deeply woven into it that I thought was just, yeah, absolutely brilliant. So I am really excited to dive into that discussion as soon as, Mom has actually seen the movie.
Yes, I will get out sometime in the next couple of weeks and see
Date night?
Date night. Sounds good. Well, everybody, I hope you're having a good holiday season and that you will get to spend time around mostly positive family members. That's what we wish for you for this season. And go see Wicked if you have a chance so you will know what we're talking about when we have that conversation.
And also because it's just a lot of fun.
and because it's a lot of fun and we all need that. We'll catch you next time.
Bye.
If you found this episode interesting, informative, amusing, please review and follow us on your podcasting platform of choice. Getting those reviews and follows really helps us show up more in the algorithm and be able to reach more people to help them. You can find us on social media, Instagram, and Threads at queerkid.straightmom, Blue Sky at qksm.bsky.social, and Facebook at Queer Kid Straight Mom. We are no longer on Twitter.
And if you're feeling especially generous, please consider joining our Patreon by searching Queer Kids Straight Mom. It helps us fund this podcast.